we were able to do back in the 2010s.
How do you rate the Ducks this year? What do you think about Oregon?
Well, your viewers might not like it. No, just kidding. So I have Oregon number one.
Say that again.
I have Oregon number one. Now I know how the year ended for Oregon. I never put too much emphasis on a single game. So they went out with a bit of a whimper. We know that. I don't have to explain that to anyone here. But when we talked earlier, I mentioned how I kind of, when I do power ratings, I downweight outliers, and one reason I do that is for games like that. I don't think that was a representative football game for the Oregon Ducks in 2025. It was their worst performance at the worst time. But coming into this year, I just think they have such depth of talent across the board. Offensively, I just love the running backs. I like Moore as a quarterback. They've got receiver depth. They've got the offensive line. They've got, if you look at the atlas, if you pick up a copy and you're checking out Oregon, what you'll see is essentially those star players I was talking about before. You'll see a whole lot of them, 1 stars, 2 stars, 3 stars, up and down the roster. I think they're loaded. One thing I really like about Oregon too is they have a lot of returning production value. So that's one thing. I call it RV or replacement value, but for me that's kind of shorthand. It's not sort of the traditional baseball version of that term. For me, it just is essentially it's quality production. So for me, that's an experience measure, a quality experience measure. Usually what you find with a team like Oregon or any team that's coming out of the playoff, that those numbers, they tend to rank fairly low. And you could sort of intuit why that is, because if a team had a really excellent year, made the playoff, that means they had a very, very successful season. They're probably going to lose a bunch of players to the NFL, right? Or even to the transfer portal market, potentially. But in this case, Oregon actually rates quite well. They have a lot of returning experience. That's one of the things I like most about them, because if you combine that with, again, I do still look at recent power ratings, just not the same way we used to, not with as much weight as back in the 2010s, but they were still like a 99% power rating team on a 0 to 100 scale. I mean, this was not like a team that, even though we have the sour taste in the mouth from the final game, that was an excellent football team. I mean, I think that first game against Indiana was a much more representative game of what Oregon really was last year, not the second one. So anyway, I think they're poised to make a serious run, with the caveat that we talked about earlier, that variance is high in college football. And so when I project Oregon number one, that's still, with regression to the mean effects and the way your probability works, that still only looks like a 10-2, 11-1 type of season projection on the onset. But I do think they're certainly one of the clear favorites, and I think their chances of getting to the playoff are extremely high. In fact, getting to the playoff now is easier than getting to the Big Ten championship. Winning the Big Ten is much harder than making the playoff. So I think the Ducks are 70% or better to get to the playoff. Now winning the Big Ten, that's a different story, because there's some tough competitors near the top of that field.
Indiana and Ohio State obviously are 2 of them.
Absolutely. Now, so Indiana's such a fun case. I mean, they've been probably dissected more than anyone. Everyone wants to know who's the next Curt Cignetti, who's the next Indiana. I have a couple answers for those things, I think, that might be different than what others think. But in terms of Indiana, the last couple of years, I've definitely been high on them coming into the year because of the way I have this sort of adaptive dynamic prediction framework. The work they had done in the portal, to me, along with their coaching quality, really showed that they looked like, top quality teams. Now, 2 years ago, it's a little different, but everyone picked them last 2 years ago. No one probably remembers that anymore. But in the preseason, they were consensus last in the Big Ten. And my boldness at the time, if for what it's worth, is I picked them like 8th or 9th. And that was like this really outrageous prediction. And I took a lot of flack for it back then. And then actually, of course, they clearly outperformed that. And then last year, again, I think this is a good example for Oregon fans, I think, because if people remember, the year before, Indiana, they flamed out at the end. They hadn't played a good schedule, and then they got boat raced out of the season at the end. And so people thought, well, that shows they're not quite ready, right? And so I think when we looked at the preseason last year, a lot of people still had question marks and were tapping the brakes and saying, yeah, they play a soft schedule. When push came to shove, they weren't ready to compete. And so a lot of people didn't have him ranked very high, but I did. I had him in my top 10 because I thought they had such quality. And Fernando Mendoza coming over from Cal, I had him rated as a 99 percentile quarterback coming into the year, based on that player rating system. People think he just arrived and blew up at Indiana. He did, of course, but you could project that he was an excellent elite quarterback already from his time at Cal. And so that's the kind of thing I apply. And so I think that's the lesson for like Oregon fans might think, well, the way we looked at the end, I don't know. I'd sort of like put that out of your mind, just realize, one game does not a season make. And then this team looks certainly capable of making that deep run again.
Well, that's encouraging. I noticed also in the Atlas, you've got Washington as maybe a little bit of a surprise this year.
Yeah. I think so. What I like about Washington is that's one of the clearer sort of. I always have some of these because it's because I do all my own original work that no matter what, I'm always going to have some things that are just different than the consensus out there. For me, that's what's exciting. I like that. So with Washington, yeah, I think they're a bit of a dark horse right now. I like where they're sitting, kind of sort of lurking beneath the surface of playoff contenders. Their offense is explosive. I mean, you can wonder, and I put this in my Atlas, and I almost wondered if I should, because I don't like to speculate on the unknowables, but I did wonder, well, it does depend on DeMond Williams being an elite quarterback. And I know there was the drama with him on whether he was going to stay or go, and whether, Washington kind of, they played some hardball to keep him there. And I thought, well, I wonder how much the motivation affects those things. But I thought, that's not my field. I don't deal in motivation. I deal with the statistics that are available to me. And I like the running backs. I like the receivers. I like their scheme. Defensively, it's always going to be a little bit of I don't know if question mark's the right word, but I think that is one of a Jed Fish staff. It's a little bit like a Lincoln Riley staff in a sense, maybe not quite as extreme, but it's always going to be more of a offensive focus. And so some staffs, you can just see it when you look at the numbers, and fans can see it when they watch the games, right? You see that they have this sort of tendency towards offensive firepower, focus, putting up big numbers. Defense is sometimes a bit of an afterthought. So I would have some reservation about whether the defense keeps up with that offense and puts that offense in good positions throughout the year. But I do think they're being undersold as a legitimate contender from the Big Ten.
Interesting. My friend Roman Tomashov of Locked on Huskies would be delighted and think you're a brilliant guy, which you obviously are.
Yeah, well, those are the right people to talk to, right? The ones that when I'm high on the team, it's like then people are excited and it's fun, I figure, well, hey, if I'm going to go on an Oregon show, this is great because I already have Oregon #1. So there's it's a friendly audience. That sometimes you talk to people and like, well, you have to be the bearer of bad news at least. It's like, well, I'm not as high on them this year, and well, and that's a little bit different place to be. But it's fun to see that. I think they're sort of an under the radar contender, and there's others. What's fun about the Atlas for me is that fans can then go in there and see. I have all the money lines and point spreads and everything like that. That if you're into that stuff, it's there, and you can compare it to what the market shows, and so you can clearly see wherever it is that there looks to be some sort of edge in that space. So a team like Washington, I think they're undervalued for the playoff, which means they're also undervalued for the Big Ten, I think, too. And then you could go into other conferences like this, a Big Ten show. But if you go down to the SEC, where you're going to get a bunch of playoff teams out of there, probably someone like Oklahoma, that's a team that's a little bit inverted from Washington. They're more of a defensive structure first, but that's a team that I think is undervalued. That has a real good shot at the playoff if John Mateer is actually back to form, which I think he probably will be. So those are some of the things you can pick up looking at the Atlas.
I've read that Mateer is bulked up in the offseason to 235. So
I heard that.
That maybe makes him a little tougher to defend and a little better chance of staying durable and effective through the year. It's a long grind to the playoff.
It's a long drive, and he plays a physical football game, doesn't he? So I've seen the talk from the quarterback camps or wherever he was that he's certainly bulked up, ready for the season. So that's veering down to the southeast. But yeah, if someone like that, it always depends on quarterback, right? I mean, you can only go so far without a quarterback really playing at a high level. Like if you want to be a national contender, that quarterback's got to deliver. I mean, that's just fundamental. All the other stuff is fun, bells and whistles. But if the quarterback isn't playing well, you're not going to make it deep into the playoffs. You're not going to make the Big Ten championship or the SEC championship. And so, watching those guys, seeing how these guys come back from injury are always kind of interesting to me, because has their form changed? Are they going to return to the level they were before? For me, Mateer was a really highly rated guy for me going into the season last year. A little bit lower this year because of, the performance wasn't as good post-injury, fair or not, but that's how you kind of have to adjust things. And so I'll be excited to see how he looks.
What does the College Football Atlas say about Dante Moore and his potential to be the number one quarterback in college football?
Well, number one, that's a little bit of a stretch for me, but I think he could be an efficient operator of this offense. Certainly he can grow. I have him listed as a star player, a star quarterback in the country. I don't have him up in that top echelon. I think I have about four guys that I list as 3-star quarterbacks. Guys like Julian Sayin, Trinidad Chambliss, Darian Mensah. Those are a few. Those are some of the very top guys to me. And, they're different kinds of players. I think Mensah's clearly at that level. Sayin, some people might disagree. He's a hyper efficient quarterback in an explosive, what I think is a top offense in college football. A guy like Chambliss has all kinds of otherworldly abilities. Then the last one I have is Arch Manning, that I almost hate to say it because I know the reaction you get when you start talking about Arch Manning anywhere. He is one polarizing figure. In fact, I described him as a Texas and as a bit of a Rorschach test, and part of it is Arch Manning because people see what they want to see. So some people think Manning is unfairly elevated, and others think no, he's a talented guy in his own right. And anyway, statistically speaking, he's there for me. So those are the guys I list as the top. I think Moore could easily break into, I don't know about that 3-star level of the top few, but I think he can get up there pretty high if he's efficient this year. And I like Moore as a quarterback.
Okay. Now, in the Atlas, you say that the Ducks have one major flaw or weakness. Talk about that. Tell me what that is.
Yeah. So it's like, what is it, right? Field goal kicking. So, okay, this is kind of a funny one. I mean, it's such a stacked team. You got the offense, you got the defense. You could go through position by position all you want, and they're, like I said, literally star players at every single position group. I mean, there'll be plenty of teams that only have a couple of notable like star level players, at least in the way that I designate them. Oregon's got it in spades. They've got it at all, every unit, except for on the special team side, like a field goal kicker. Just not a lot of proven success there in the way I rate things. Not to go too deep into the weeds on field goal kicking, but one way I look at field goal kicking is just the difficulty of the kicks that are being made. So I don't just measure it as like what's the percentage of field goals they made or PATs. I look at the range of the kick, the probability of essentially an average kicker making that kick. You compare it to how many of those they made, they missed. You get essentially what they call an expected points added model, which a lot of people use things like this. I have my own versions of those, also known as EPA, if people are familiar with like the analytics kind of terminology. And so I use those to then essentially rate all these kickers from the FBS and the FCS level. And that's the one weakness. They just show up as a little bit average there. Now, it's important because everyone knows field goal kicks can be the difference in any big game. It could come down to a field goal at the end. And so as much as we, overlook special teams sometimes, it's important and it's something to keep in mind. If we're coming down to it and you make it back to the Big Ten championship, you get a rematch with, say, Indiana or someone. Does it come down to a field goal? If it does, that might be one thing to watch for. And certainly throughout the season, I think we'll get a better sense as the year goes on, as if that's an efficient phase of the game for the Ducks, if they're outperforming, what I have in the Atlas there, that's a really good sign that's even their one supposed weakness could be, if that can become more of a strength or something more reliable, then, they don't have too many chinks in the armor.
Well, the Oregon players have taken to calling new kicker Gage Urich from Westland High School, first year as a starter there. They've taken to call him the Iceman because he's making big kicks when they try to simulate them in practice. Of course, that's practice.
Yep. See, this is the stuff that's fun too, because like with the Atlas, I'm all based on, I factor in recruiting, but it's largely based in the way of great players based on what they've done in games at the Division I college football level. And so when you have new players, they're going to start off with more of an average looking rating, generally speaking, especially at a position like field goal kicker, because one thing I do with player ratings is I essentially adjust what the expectation is based on the talent level for that position. Some positions like defense, recruiting talent matters more on defense than on offense. For instance, that's why you see fewer great defensive teams and more offensive explosive teams. Like you can see a lot of like good offenses in the MAC or the MWC. You don't see as many great defenses, right? Because it's harder to get those elite defensive linemen, those elite cornerbacks, whatever it may be. So from that pure, like on average, generally speaking, talent matters most on defense, and then on offense, and then lastly, special teams. And so with field goal kicks, usually the talent rating of a program or the recruitings doesn't matter that much. The proof is sort of in the pudding with those guys, and it doesn't really, he could be a top-rated recruit or a under-the-radar recruit, and it's not very predictive of future success at the field goal when you're kicking field goals. So I'll be interested to see how the Iceman looks when he comes into the games and if he's bombing those field goals. And more importantly, I don't actually care that much about range. I mean, I know a lot of guys these days really have long range with the kicks now. It's been something that's changed in the game in the past 10, 15 years. What I'll be watching for is, does he make those big ones, those clutch kicks? They might only be 35, 40 yarders, but does he hit those when the game's still in doubt?
No matter how good a team is, it seems like there's always one or two or three games a year that come down to the kicker.
It is, whether you think it's exciting or like close your eyes, look away, just wait to hear what the announcers say. I get it. But no matter what, there will be a point in the season that he's got to hit an important field goal for the Ducks to move forward. That's almost a given.
Well, let's hope the Iceman can shoot down the MiG and make that big kick. Now, you say talent is most important on defense. That makes me feel, as a fan, really good about the Ducks because they are loaded with defensive talent.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you look at like the linebacker, for instance, and even pulling up my own copy of the Atlas that I have here, just absolutely loaded. You look at, I rank them, top 10 in the country. You got star players along the D line. You got some important transfers coming over where you needed them. I think in the secondary, they got couple of players that can help out. But really, like with a team that tends to run more 3-4 types of looks, I think having that deep linebacking core is really critical. And then having those strong guys up front, whether you're talking about your Bear Alexanders or whoever, they don't always get to flash all the statistics. They don't get to necessarily get all the big TFL numbers or sack numbers that the quote unquote edge guys that we call them nowadays get to have, the headliner players. But those guys are critical, and if they can keep that linebacking core clean, boy, that Duck defense really looks good.
Statistics can't always measure penetration or disruption or eating space.
No, and it's, when you have to tie up the blockers and free up the linebackers, we kind of all know that's how some of these schemes work. Yeah, it's grunt work sometimes, right? Yeah, and you don't always see the big tackle numbers from those guys. It can harm them in the rating systems a little. One thing I do to try to mitigate those effects to some degree is I don't ever just rate the players, or in this case, like talking about like D linemen like Bear Alexander, for instance. I don't just rate them on just the pure statistics they produce, because that's an unfair system. And that's unfair to certain guys and certain schemes. What I do is I rate them within the structure of the scheme. And so, how good is, say, Oregon's run defense in a given year, or their pass rush? And then essentially I will parcel out credit to these things to the guys on that defense. And so it's not just about specifically what they did. They're also indirectly impacted by the success or failure of those around them. And so if if like the secondary, which if there's a weaker spot, maybe the secondary I might have a few more middling questions about. We'll see how that comes together. But if that secondary is struggling in coverage, well, that's also a byproduct of maybe a pass rush not getting home. That could be not just on the D-line, but also in more of a 3-4 kind of look. You're also thinking outside linebackers. Are they getting to the quarterback? The guys that need to be putting that pressure on. So if, the guys in the back are struggling, getting beat on some deep balls, well, then that's indirectly also going to affect the ratings on the pass defense side of those front seven players that are supposed to be, whether covering tight ends or providing that penetration and pressure on the passer. It all is interconnected. And I think that's how football works. And so that's why I try to design a rating system that also reflects that.
Defense has got to be cohesive. Everybody's got to be playing their roles. Within the Oregon program this year, the coaching staff is really emphasizing the havoc rate and improving their havoc rate and getting home.
Yeah, havoc's an interesting one. I think Bill Connolly was the one who started the havoc rate concept, I believe, some back in the 2010s, I would say. And yeah, if people aren't as familiar with it, it's just a way of creating those disruptive football plays on defense, right? So your tackles for loss, your pass breakups, your sacks, your forced fumbles, all those things. Batted balls, all these things. And I think, boy, would not every defensive coordinator in the country want to see more of this? Probably the fans too, right? Because it's just fun to watch when you see those teams that can do that kind of stuff. Yeah, they absolutely disrupt an offense. It's all those things. It's interesting when you hear about what the coaches focus on, every preseason. For me, as a guy like me, I to be honest, I kind of ignore it because there's always some interesting coach speak. It's not because I don't think it's interesting. It's because when it's still just preseason camp stuff, we don't have any tangible numbers or anything that we can place on it. So as a fan, I might think, well, that sounds good. That sounds, I like the idea of creating more disruptive plays. As an analyst, I wait and see. So are they delivering in October when the games really start to count? That's when it's, again, that proof in the pudding concept. So, at that point, are they getting that disruptive level that they're looking for? So that'll be interesting to watch. I think if I'm focused as an Oregon fan, I'm probably not too concerned about the front seven generally. From my perspective, I'd be looking at the secondary and seeing how they hold up against some of the better passing offenses that Oregon's going to face throughout the season. I think that's going to be a more telling indicator as the year goes on.
The indicators start to get real when they play USC on September 28th.
Yeah, and actually, even a couple weeks before that, I mentioned Oklahoma State earlier. Mm-hmm. Oklahoma State is going to have a very explosive offense, one that can put up tons of points. Now, there might be a game that's being overlooked by people who aren't like all zeroed in on the transfer portal and, focusing more on Big Ten football and things like that. But what happened at Oklahoma State was after Mike Gundy had a tough couple of years and they brought in a new coaching staff. They brought in Eric Morris from North Texas. Eric Morris and North Texas have one of the best offensive coaching staffs in the country. And they brought in an amazing transfer class, including, Drew Mestemaker, a quarterback, who was their quarterback in North Texas, along with some other great players from there and other good players from around the country. That offense is going to be very good, and it will test that Oregon secondary early on. I want to say it's their second game of the year.
It is. They're playing in Stillwater.
Stillwater.
In addition to Mestemaker, they've got Caleb Hawkins as a 1,400-yard rusher. So you're absolutely right, obviously, that they're explosive and a little scary.
They're scary. So Oklahoma State is that classic offensive powerhouse where, they fit in with the Big 12. Or Eric Morris, I guess, fits in with the Big 12 because they're going to put up lots of points. Defense is a bit secondary there. So do I think Oklahoma State is going to upset Oregon? No, I don't. But I don't think it's a game you can take lightly. And really, Oregon actually opens up with a tough schedule. I mean, I mentioned October, but the reality is it's actually pretty tough in September because, I mean, 3 of the 4 games are against live opponents. Like Boise State, everyone knows Boise. I mean, they're probably not, they don't have this isn't like the Boise team that beat Oklahoma all those years ago, but I mean, Boise's always a team you have to take seriously, especially in an opener when so much can go awry in an opener when things are unsettled. You still, no matter what, you have a bit of a new team in the transfer portal era. The team's even newer than it used to be because there's always new guys coming in, new faces to work in. So those games are going to be interesting. I think Oregon will be okay against Boise, but I do think that Oklahoma State, that's a tough one. I think they'll win. I had it about 80% chance if I recall correctly. But it's that's one to watch out for. So if Duck fans are thinking, well, that's a 1 in 5 shot at an upset. Yeah, exactly. That's one to watch out for. So if the Ducks aren't playing well, if they're not buttoned up in the back, Oklahoma State will exploit that. So it'll be an early test. And certainly that's kind of a precursor to then what you'll see against USC a couple weeks later.
I totally believe that, and I'm looking forward to that game. I'm curious, Justin, when you watch games at home on a Saturday, are you able to take off your statistician's hat and just enjoy football, put that hat on the coffee table and just enjoy a more-to-more touchdown pass? Or do you find yourself crunching numbers in your head?
No, I do not crunch numbers in my head when I'm watching. I definitely can sort of, I can just separate the two. What I do is I kind of watch them as a fan first and foremost. I just enjoy football in general. I'll watch any 2 teams play pretty much. I watch as many as I can. And for me, you would never hear me say, "Oh, there's no big games this week." That would never come out of my mouth. You know, there's always exciting football games every week. And so when I watch, I kind of watch it the way we discussed earlier, where I'm focused on the schemes, the players, some of the predictions. Yeah, the predictions and how close those come in, those do enter my mind. But I'm not like trying to calculate anything on the fly. I just like to watch a game and see who's excelling. I am interested in which teams are underperforming or overperforming early on. I think those are really interesting indicators to me, because sometimes you can get a sense early that maybe a team, now hopefully for the fans of the show is not the case, but if Oregon, boy, they struggle against Boise and then they're taken to the wire by Oklahoma State, you might start to worry, like, I'm not so sure about that 70+% chance of reaching the playoff. It looks like they're struggling with teams that are more of dark horses to get to the playoffs. So that would be the kind of concern. And on the flip side is if they just steamroll both of those opponents, boy, you'd start to feel pretty good about what the prospects are for the season. So I'm always looking at it compared to expectation. But overall, though, and just in the flow of a game, I tend to start watching, and just as anyone else, I kind of naturally might start to root for a team or root for one over the other. It's not always, sometimes it's just sort of like an organic thing, like you feel like this team earned it, or maybe this underdog, they fought so hard, it would be cool to see them pull it off, that kind of stuff. Even if I didn't give them much chance to win the game in the preseason prediction, it's still fun, right? Even if they're like a 2% chance to win, boy, it's exciting when it happens though, right? So I that's the kind of stuff that I watch.
In the moment when you're just watching, football is a game of emotion and momentum.
It is. And so you feel it as a fan, and you'll be watching, and sometimes you're like, you can pretty clearly see, well, some games, this is kind of a stinker, right? But the teams, Ohio State's beating someone 28-0 early in the second quarter, and you think, well, okay, I don't think this one's turning around or going to be competitive or particularly compelling anytime soon. But yeah, one thing to the point you're making about, momentum and emotion, one thing I look at that I find very kind of informative and illuminating is I'll look at the evolution of a team's power rating throughout a season. This is kind of a fascinating thing to me because I think people also will look at, we're talking about the early games being sort of a bellwether, but also sometimes you might see a team have a couple of bad games, but then they climb back up to where they were originally supposed to be. And so sometimes, analysts like me or fans too can just sort of overrate what happens in one weird game or two that had a lot of weird bounces, maybe a pick six or a kickoff return for a touchdown. These things kind of throw off like the prediction sense of a game. And so those are all these things. When you see how the power ratings change over the course of the year, they're really dynamic. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you could see a team that starts really high, they dip down, and then as the year goes on, they climb back up and they end up about where you expected them to be. But if you think back to how the narrative around the team throughout, whether the people on TV, the commentators, et cetera, the articles people write about them, for a while it might be this team is headed to the playoff. Then later it's doom and gloom, and then it's back to, oh, it looks like they're going to make the playoff after all. And so one thing that I always emphasize is how much variability there is, not just in the overall win-loss totals, but even from a game-to-game perspective. The performances, when I look at game ratings, which I have in the Atlas as well, you can look at the 2025 game ratings. You can see how much, with Oregon, they're pretty consistent. But if you look throughout the preseason preview at some of the other teams, you'll see a lot of variability. You'll see teams that have some really good outings and some really poor ones. Essentially, you'll see a team that plays like, they could look like a playoff contender one week and then look like a G6 mid-tier kind of also ran another week. And that's just part of the college football landscape as well.
Yeah, that makes me think of Oregon in the year they beat Michigan. I think it was 2003. They beat Michigan. Michigan had a great win. And at that point in Oregon's history, I mean, that was a huge thing. And then they go on to lose like 3 or 4 of their next 5 games.
Yeah.
It was just a case of a team that just, as you said, performs like a playoff contender one week and like dog do the next.
One example of that I remember it was a couple of years ago. People might remember if Florida State was like a lock. People thought they were a lock for the playoff a couple of years ago. And then they went out to Dublin and they played Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech won on a last-second field goal. It was when Brent Key became the run the damn ball guy, if people remember that pretty viral quote. So because he was asked about the offensive line, so people probably remember that. And at the time, speaking of like the reactions to the moment, I remember some of the kind of more national analyst type people started penciling Georgia Tech into their Final Four playoff bracket, because of that one win. And then I think Florida State went on to lose 10 games or 11 games. They had a terrible year. I forget the number of wins and losses.
It was awful.
It was awful. And then it was, in hindsight, it's like, oh, okay. Well, that was a really nice, fun win for Georgia Tech, but it was not a precursor to a playoff run, as it turns out. And so sometimes it's not even just about how your own team is playing, but how the opponent may be overvalued or undervalued. And we just don't really know it in September, but we'll know it by November.
Well, Justin, you've been very gracious with your time, and I appreciate it. The College Football Atlas, a tremendous tool for both fans and folks who like to make a little money on college football. We would love to have you back later on the year to talk about some of the developing trends and the identities of teams as they're growing clearer. It would be great to see you again.
Yeah, I'd love it. Just let me know. I'll be happy to come back on.
Well, I appreciate you, and I hope you enjoy the season. Take care.
Okay, same to you, Dale. Thanks for having me on.
And we're out.